In May of 2020, India's east coast was struck by a powerful tropical cyclone Amphan. Wind gusts with speeds up to 270 kilometers per hour swept away everything in their path due to catastrophic destruction. More than 3 million people lost their homes, and the damaged power lines deprived the region's inhabitants of any communication with the outside world. You might think a cataclysm of that magnitude must have claimed thousands of lives, but in fact, the number of victims, fortunately, turned out to be much more modest: 128 people. But 50 years before Amphan, the opposite happened in the same region. A seemingly ordinary storm almost led to the collapse of the entire civilization. You probably never heard of the Bola cyclone, but it almost killed you before you were even born. But how can one natural disaster trigger a real Armageddon? Sometimes catastrophes cause terrible damage because they are literally invisible to us. On November 12, 1970, the stormy air mass of the future Bola cyclone began to form over the central Bay of Bengal. Then, at a speed of 240 kilometers per hour, moved east into the most densely populated areas of present-day Bangladesh, which was then part of Pakistan, as the easternmost province. And all this is a widespread scenario for any coastal region close to the tropics. After all, residents of such places annually endure at least 6 such disasters. However, the Bola cyclone held the same trump card against people as the recent magnitude 7 earthquake that struck Haiti on January 12, 2010. Back then, the North American plate on which the island lies collided with the Caribbean plate. As a result, thousands of square kilometers of territory literally jumped on the spot. Port-au-Prince, the capital of an already impoverished state, was left without critical infrastructure, almost all communication systems, transport means, and government buildings have been completely destroyed. But the locals, and especially the government, knew. Didn't they? Sounds crazy, but even in 2010, teaching the basic do's and don'ts during an earthquake. But most importantly, the government just didn't consider it necessary to allocate funds for disaster monitoring and maintaining the readiness of local emergency warning systems. Thus, the earthquake, which could theoretically be predicted a few dozen minutes before the impact, became a completely invisible killer. Most of its victims died under the rubble of demolished buildings before being evacuated. Over 300,000 people in total. And that's not counting the same number of missing people. But in contrast to tremors, the formation of enormous tropical cyclones is not so difficult to predict, let alone notice, is it? But the Bola cyclone occurred amid a highly turbulent political landscape. In those years, India and Pakistan clashed over the ownership of disputed territories. Normally, the Indian Meteorological Services would have provided the information on the incipient cyclone to the Pakistani government in time. But not in 1970. More of our disagreements even prompted the Pakistani government to change the cyclone intensity scale from India's 10-point scale to a new 5-point scale. As a result, even those warnings about a category 4 storm received by the residents of coastal areas didn't sound so serious. People thought it was 4 out of 10, not 4 out of 5. So the Bola cyclone approached the shore carefully disguised and caught the population of East Pakistan by surprise. The first victims were those who happened to have the misfortune to be on the coast at the time. The raging waves just wash people into the open ocean. As luck would have it, the storm struck at high tide, so the water level rose much higher than usual. Because of this, there was not a single survivor on 30 coastal islands. For the next 24 hours, the run-of-the-mill Bola cyclone killed around 500,000 people, including as many as 46,000 fishermen who went to sea. And since many coastal villages lived off the daily catch, That loss also led to a real humanitarian disaster in subsequent years. We can imagine the same scenario where similar cyclone covers the southeast coast of the United States. Nowadays, the U.S. government provides prompt warnings of such hurricane to citizens, but if the system got attacked by hackers or suffered any other technical failure, such a disaster could claim the lives of 500,000 or even 1 million people, and not because it would be inherently dangerous, just because unforeseen circumstances would intervene. One of them is something none of us want to think about, but that doesn't make this scenario any less real. We are accustomed to the government's devotion to saving the population during natural disasters. But what if it does exactly the opposite and deliberately abandons us to the mercy of fate? On November 3, 2013, an abnormally low pressure for this region was recorded in the Western Pacific. And while scientists were trying to figure out its cause, the humid and warm air from the ocean began to rise, forming thunder clouds. A few hours later, Typhoon Haiyan, the Philippines. The wind speed that day was about 315 kilometers per hour. That's an absolute record for the entire history of observations of Western Pacific typhoons. Just 12 hours, the coastal city of Surigao had the monthly rainfall. One of the first buildings damaged was the Tacloban Airport building, covered by a stream as high as 5.5 meters. The water reached the second floor of the terminal. Some low-lying areas of the city were completely washed away. Over 90% of all buildings in the region were damaged. As a result, Typhoon Haiyan claimed the lives of around 7,500 people. If a similar cataclysm occurred in the central United States, for example, in Colorado, Denver, the state's largest city, would be almost completely destroyed in just a few hours. Combined with avalanches, snowstorms, and other natural disasters that typhoon could have triggered in the region, would have killed over 600,000 people. But this would happen only if the federal government treated the situation as negligently as the Philippine one. In 2013, even though they received a message about the impending disaster and time, almost nothing was done. Leaders at different levels failed to coordinate, and we're just waiting for someone else to spring into action. Moreover, even when the Philippine government finally emerged from its stupor, its efforts only made matters worse. Evacuation centers offered as shelters for desperate people often turned out to be deadly traps. For example, Tacloban City, designated as a shelter, was completely flooded, along with everyone who had taken cover in it shortly after the disaster began. Whereas the people in the Philippines suffered from criminal negligence, the Pakistani authorities deliberately condemned the eastern province residents to death under the blows of the Bola cyclone in 1970. But why? Back in 1947, when the British government granted independence to British India, the lands were divided along religious lines, and that's how Muslim Pakistan emerged, divided by India into a major western part and eastern part, where Bengalis have lived from time immemorial. And despite the common religion, they considered themselves a separate nation. When the Bola cyclone hit their land, Yahya Khan was the president of West Pakistan. The Bengalis hated him. And to avoid making things worse for himself in the next election, Yahya Khan made the cynical decision to sabotage the aid to the affected province by all means. Instead of opening their borders to foreign aid, West Pakistani officials did tame convoys, transporting medical supplies, food and drinking water. In addition, they banned air cargo shipment to East Pakistan, forcing it to be transported along destroyed roads instead. All of this, to the dire consequences of the cyclone, made the situation in the region explosive. One natural disaster can indeed push millions of people into a bloody war. In the spring of 1931, the rainy season began in China. Although the locals were already accustomed to such climate shocks, The rain beat down incessantly for several months. Soon, the water level in the rivers rose so much that the flooding, blink of it, about 180,000 square kilometers. That's an area equivalent to the size of England and half of Scotland combined. People were trying to escape on rooftops, but the water rose so high that it completely flooded most of the one-story buildings. In some regions, the floodwaters didn't receive for several months. Many agricultural lands were so eroded that it took them a few years to become fertile again. The flood killed over 3.5 million people in China notably. Most of them did not drown, but starved to death in the next few weeks after the disaster. If a similar catastrophe occurred in today's United States, it would probably hit Michigan, as the Great Lakes system is located in its territory. And if all these water bodies overflowed, the consequences would affect half of the entire U.S. In part of Canada, as was the case in China in 1931, the population in the flood zone would first a severe famine. Is there many agricultural lands and livestock farms that supply food to other states? Moreover, such flooding would inevitably affect areas prone to landslides, leaving, according to conservative estimates, as many as 40 million people homeless. Such a natural hazard, combined with the government's inaction, could lead to a real rebellion against the federal government. In China in the 1930s, officials did their best to spark public outrage. They cut down vast forests in the Yangtze River basin to make a buck on timber exports. Because of this, the riverbanks were severely eroded by heavy rains. What's more, at that time, the government was unable to organize a proper evacuation or even render aid to the victims. This angered the Chinese so much that it encouraged the most radical among them to join the National Revolutionary Army. It soon entered a bloody civil war and played a key role in the subsequent Chinese Revolution, which led to the establishment of a communist regime in the country. And maybe if 1931 had been a drier year in China, the entire history of the 20th century would have been different. That fateful Bola cyclone, amid the crimes of the Pakistani government, led the Bengali population in the east to rebel. Their leader, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, head of the Awami League party, demanded immediate autonomy. But Yahya Khan had his own plans to quell popular discontent. He launched Operation Searchlight and sent an army to the Eastern Territories. His forces planned to take control of all major cities and obliterate the Bengali opposition. It put up fierce resistance, and as a result, between 500,000 and 1 million East Pakistanis became victims of this civil war. The Bola cyclone turned into a real genocide. But no one could have predicted that the lives of everyone in everything on planet Earth would soon be at risk. Some natural disasters can suddenly bring humanity to the verge of a nuclear catastrophe. On March 11, 2011, one of the most powerful tsunamis in modern history covered the Japanese coast. Waves over 40 meters high overtook populated areas up to 10 kilometers in length. Almost 20,000 people died during the disaster, and over 2,500 went missing. But the absolute horror began when tsunami waves damaged 3 reactors of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. As a result of this accident, over the next few months, around 300 tons of seawater were contaminated with radioactive waste. And although the Japanese government managed to eliminate the threat, it's still struggling with the consequences of the accident. However, the Bola cyclone almost flooded the entire world with radiation half a century ago in 1971. When the civil war in East Pakistan was in full swing, neighboring India decided to step in and support the Bengalis, and since Delhi maintained allied relations with the Soviet Union, this threatened the United States with increased Soviet influence in the region. Against the backdrop of the Vietnam War, it looked like a total nightmare for President Richard Nixon. So show India and the USSR, who is the master of the region, he ordered the dispatch of the USS Enterprise, the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, to the Bay of Bengal. In response, Soviet command sent 3 submarines with nuclear missiles into direct order to open fire if the Americans advanced too close to India. The crew stationed on the USS Enterprise decided that counteraction wouldn't frighten them, and they'd fulfill the mission despite everything. So in the winter of 1971, the world froze on the brink of a collision between 2 nuclear superpowers, and all because of the aftermath of the Bola cyclone. Fortunately, on December 16th, the Bengali rebels defeated the Pakistani forces without external intervention. As a result, a new country, Bangladesh, appeared on the map. Sure thing, such a combination of events can hardly be repeated nowadays, but the climate has changed so much over recent decades that it may well surprise us with a global catastrophe. On December 26, 2004, the day after Christmas, the Indonesian island of Sumatra suffered one of the most intense earthquakes ever observed, with a magnitude of 9.1. Even though it lasted only 10 minutes, shaking was registered across much of Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, Thailand, Myanmar, India, and Sri Lanka. Tremors were recorded even by the South African National Seismograph Network, although it's located 8,000 kilometers away from the Empire Center. The earthquake didn't leave a single building in Sumatra intact. But the worst was still ahead. For the locals, the cataclysm was so powerful that it caused enormous water displacement in the Indian Ocean. The gigantic seeding mass moved right towards Indonesia. A wave as high as 30 meters covered the coastal city of Banda Aceh, instantly killing around 130,000 people. Buildings collapsed like houses of cards, and water streams uprooted many trees and carried away not only people but entire buses into the ocean. Then the waves moved further across the Indian Ocean at speeds of up to 800 kilometers per hour, and an hour and a half later, they hit the coastal provinces of Thailand and Sri Lanka. In total, the tsunami claimed the lives of 230,000 people, and about 20,000 of them were foreign tourists who came to celebrate Christmas in a warmer climate. If a similar earthquake occurred, saved in Kansas, would not only affect all states but also trigger 2 tsunamis at once in the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Presumably, a giant wave could completely wash away Hawaii and some other island states, cross the entire Pacific Ocean, and cover the Japanese coast. Does this sound like science? Big shit. Not at all. Experts now tend to believe that the effects of the earthquake of 2004 were greatly intensified by El Niño, a cyclical climate phenomenon in the Pacific Ocean. It mixes warm tropical waters in the western Pacific, shifts the leastward, and distributes them along the equator. In recent research suggests that El Niño may be the root cause of most major natural disasters of the past century, including Bola cyclone. The worst part is that it introduces an element of unpredictability into our climate models. That's because when warm waters move too far, the pressure in several regions of the world's oceans changes, and the winds suddenly change their direction. Some climate researchers believe that in the 2030s, this could result in a cascade of natural disasters that individually would be ordinary, but collectively are able to inflict terrible damage on the U.S. at the level of the Bola cyclone is actually, if we don't unravel the Helmanile pattern and fail to properly prepare and warn the population and even the part of the U.S. that usually feels completely safe, could suffer. Recently, a team of scientists from Yale University came to a startling conclusion. In an article published in the Nature Geosciences journal, they suggested that El Niño could cause tropical cyclones to spread not only to the southern latitudes but also to the middle ones, where most of the American population lives. How about a devastating hurricane with massive flooding swamping not only Miami, but also New York? Disaster movies have shown something similar many times, but are you ready to face the unpredictable natural element in reality?